Did you think that writing was gonna be a breeze? I did. That is, until reality hit. Growing up, I had always been told that I was a good writer. I found it easy and pretty fun. But the deeper I got into the craft and the more I started paying attention, the less I knew. But if that sounds like you, then that's a very good sign, because only amateur writers say that it's easy. As the novelist Thomas Mann says, a writer is someone for whom writing is very difficult. Fast forward over 20 years, and now I lead the writing program at one of the top universities in South Korea, where I've helped dozens of researchers get published and countless students start writing online. But let me tell you, it was a grind. Now, I know what you're thinking. How's he been teaching for 20 years? He's only 26 years old. Through these years of teaching academic and professional writing, I've discovered the biggest roadblock holding writers back. They see the elements of writing as a list of rules rather than a set of tools. So to help you transform your writing and unleash your creativity, I'm sharing 31 writing tools that I wish I discovered earlier and that'll help you connect with your readers. Starting with number 1. Here's a simple trick that'll make your writing so much more clear, because the difference between a clear sentence and a tangled mess that's overloaded with details all comes down to this one thing. Take a look at this example of a clear sentence from Ryan Holiday's "Stillness is the Key." The entire world changed in the few short hours between when John F. Kennedy went to bed on October 15th, 1962, and when he woke up the following morning. This sentence has a ton of details in it, but it's clear because the core elements of the sentence are right up front. The first 4 words, "the entire world changed," tells you straight away what's happening in the sentence. But watch what happens when these core elements get buried under extra words at the start of the sentence, as you'll see in the next example from the same book. Anyone who has concentrated so deeply that a flash of insight or inspiration suddenly visited them knows stillness. Here, 15 words separate the subject, anyone, from the verb, knows. Since we read from left to right, the reader has to hold the subject in short-term memory for 15 words before the verb arrives, which is pretty hard work. Clue writing is easy for the reader, so the first writing tool is something I call the locomotive effect. When you've got a sentence with a ton of details, put the subject and the verb right up front. That core clause, the subject and the verb, acts like an engine, and the rest of the details that follow hitch onto it like train cars, and that way, readers will choose you as their favorite writer. Which brings us to number 2. If you mean to make a mistake, is it really a mistake? Amateur writers are really concerned with the notions of right and wrong, so they stick to safe language and they're afraid to break the rules of writing. But here's the truth. Great writers don't just follow the rules. They bend them to create moments of strangeness. Take, for example, the famous last lines from Cormac McCarthy's Suttree. Now, to give you context, I'm going to read the full paragraph. This occurs right at the end of the book, but watch what happens in the very last sentence. "Somewhere in the grey wood by the river is the huntsman, and in the brewing corn and in the castellated press of cities. His work lies all wares, and his hounds tire not. I have seen them in a dream, slaverous and wild, and their eyes crazed with ravening for souls in this world. Fly them. Fly them." Isn't that strange? Like, we don't fly people. We fly airplanes, we fly helicopters, but you can't fly people. You can flee from people, and that's the literal meaning of this sentence. But McCarthy went with fly here. Why? Now, amateurs might consider this to be a mistake, but expert writers can see very clearly what he's up to here. And what he's up to is the same thing that the poet Dylan Thomas was doing in that famous line. "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." Now here, instead of using gently, Thomas goes with gentle. Go gentle, which is technically a mistake. This use of deliberate grammatical mistake is the second writing tool, analogy, and expert writers use it to wrench readers awake and make moments strange. Which brings us to a pretty common tip that you've probably heard before. Write at a 5th grade reading level. We see it all over the place, especially online. For example, here's Gurwinder. "Don't say stochastic if you can just say random. Don't say Bayesian prior if you can just say assumption." Now, if you think that language is just about transmitting information, then Gurwinder would be right. But of course, language is not just about information. Language is also social. And your choice of words is not only about the content, it's also about your relationship to the information and to the reader. If you always write at a 5th grade level, then what are you saying about how you think about your readers? Richard Hanania, or is it Hanania? I don't know how to say his name. Makes this point perfectly when he talks about the difference between saying, I have a prior that the presidential election will be close, and I have an assumption that the presidential election will be close. They look similar, but prior comes from the world of Bayesian reasoning. So if you say, I have a prior, then you're delivering the same information as assumption, but you're also signaling your membership in a community that values statistics and analysis. And the same goes for stochastic versus random. Both mean unpredictable, but stochastic is a precise term used in statistics that shows that you're framing the idea from that specific perspective. Always keeping it simple treats language like it's just a vehicle for information, but language is so much more than that. It's social. So for the third writing tool, you can forget the rule about writing at a 5th grade level. Of course, you don't just want to choose puffy words just for the sake of it, because they make you sound like an ass. But don't be shy about using those in-group code words that carry special meaning for your readers. Speaking of simple, what kind of a writer are you? Are you a Hemingway, a Faulkner, or are you more of a Mark fucking Manson? The writing styles of these American authors could not have been more different. Faulkner once critiqued Hemingway for never daring to use a word that might send the reader to a dictionary. And Hemingway shot back, poor old Faulkner, does he really think that big emotions come from big words? I know them all right, but there are older, simpler, and better words, and those are the ones that I use. Many people think that Hemingway won this exchange, and his spare, clean writing style is still really popular in American letters. But Faulkner's point is just as important. By sticking to simple language, we risk underestimating our audience and dulling down our own creative edge. Plain language is great for connecting with readers, but sometimes the right word can really make an idea pop, even if it sends someone to the dictionary. So writing tool number 4 is a two-parter. First, don't be afraid of those $10 words. Or with inflation, maybe they're more like $50 words. I've been sent to the dictionary plenty of times by Cormac McCarthy and James Joyce and David Foster Wallace, and I've never regretted the journey. Now, the second part is don't be afraid of those cheap words either. Look at Mark Manson's best-selling book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. You won't find language like that in the works of Hemingway or Faulkner, but that book became a bestseller because it used language that resonated and popped in the minds of their readers. There are no universal rules for writing because there are no universal readers. Writers do not have general audiences. They have specific readers. And when you know who those readers are, you can use their language to signal your in-group status with them. Moving on from vocabulary, let's look at a technique for building tension by looking at examples from it in poetry and, of course, Monty Python. Look at how the opening lines from T.S. Eliot's famous poem, The Love Song for J. Alfred Prufrock, creates this tension. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Now, those first two lines are classic enough. They invite the reader into this romantic evening stroll, but that mood is totally shattered by that third line, a patient etherized upon a table. What are these two images doing together? And now see the same technique at work in this classic scene from Monty Python's The Life of Brian.
Always look on the bright side of life.
That contrast between the cheerful song and their morbid death sentence, just like the contrast we saw in the T.S. Eliot poem, joins two writing tools together. The first one is juxtaposition, which just means placing two things side by side to highlight their similarities and differences. But the second writing tool that's combined in these scenes is irony, when the literal meaning of something splits apart from its meaning in context. So if you join them together, what you get is ironic juxtaposition. when you place two objects side by side so that each one changes how you see the other. And that's the fifth writing tool. For the sixth one, some sayings sound so smooth that they stay stuck in our skulls forever. Something sound so smooth that they... How now, brown cow? How now, brown cow? Take, for example, the most famous line from The Great Gatsby. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. What's the secret sauce here? Well, stick around to see how to use simple sounds to shape super strong sentences. Super strong sentences. If you've ever heard expressions like curiosity killed the cat, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and it takes two to tango, then you've already experienced a writing tool that makes any phrase memorable, even if the meaning is total nonsense. As Mark Forsyth points out, we naturally love words that start with the same letter. They roll off the tongue. But it's not just that they sound good. This writing tool actually makes these phrases more persuasive, even if their meaning is total nonsense. I mean, curiosity did not kill a cat. Nobody has ever thrown a baby out with bathwater, and sure, it takes two to tango, but it takes two to waltz as well. But those sayings still hang around as true, and the line from The Great Gatsby is so memorable because they sound true, and that's the power of the sixth writing tool, alliteration. Speaking of The Great Gatsby, let's take another look at that famous passage. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther. That green light, what's it doing there? What does it mean to believe in a green light? In this passage, the green light isn't just the light at the end of Daisy's dock. It becomes a powerful symbol for the American dream. And the way that passage transitions from a tangible image to an abstract idea is an example of the seventh writing tool, the ladder of abstraction. At the bottom of the ladder, you find concrete images, things that you can touch, see, and smell, something you can picture in your mind or stub your toe on. Climb a few rungs up the ladder, and now you're dealing with abstract concepts like freedom, greatness, and the American dream. The trick is to balance these levels. Sometimes writers get too caught up on the top layers, and their writing feels disconnected from reality, like it's up there in the clouds. Other writers spend all their time down near the bottom, and their work starts to feel mundane or like journalism. It feels like it doesn't carry any transcendent meaning. So as you write, try to balance out your ideas by moving up and down the ladder of abstraction, which is our seventh writing tool. Now for our eighth writing tool, it's more common in music, but you can use it to write pithy, memorable lines that hang in your reader's mind. Remember when Jay-Z said, "I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman"? Or what about when the Beatles sang, "I do all the pleasing with you, it's so hard to reason with you, why do you make me so blue?" What were they singing about here? Last night I said these words to my girl. I know you never even try, girl. Come on. Please please me. Whoa yeah, like I please you. But it's not just in music. Even Carl Jung used this writing tool when he said, "The healthy man does not torture others. Generally it is the tortured who turn into torturers." The thing that makes these lines so catchy and powerful is all thanks to a writing technique that uses a single word in various parts of speech, a technique called polyptoton. I don't know how to say it. It's Greek, and it means many cases. By repeating the word in different structural locations, it makes the reader do a double take, and it leaves your words hanging in the air. But if you're trying to make a line sound powerful and deep, the best way is not to be original. It's to take what's ordinary and turn it upside down. One master of this writing tool was Oscar Wilde, who was famous for these witty one-liners that we still quote today. Fashion is what one wears oneself. What is unfashionable is what other people wear. Journalism is unreadable, and literature is not read. The formula of these lines is pretty straightforward. X is Y, and not X is not Y. So you start with a familiar idea, and then you flip it in an unexpected way. And that sudden contrast is what makes these statements so striking. Side note, many people hate the semicolon because they don't know how to use it. And in many cases, you'd be better off not using it. But this rhetorical device is the perfect place to use a semicolon. That's because the negative and the positive side of a statement don't belong in separate sentences. They belong together in the same sentence. like two sides of the same coin. But you can't just join two sentences with a comma, so instead you can use a semicolon. This technique is called antithesis. If you want to assert something forcefully, try inverting it. The reason this works is because it covers both sides of what's true and what's not true. Now, Charles Darwin notes that writing is unnatural. Man has an instinctive tendency, he says, to speak, as we see in the babble of our young children, whereas a child has no instinctive tendency to bake, brew, or write. Speaking is natural, it occurs spontaneously with enough input, and it's the medium of social life. But writing is kind of antisocial. We do it alone in a room, and for that reason, we forget one of the most important features of writing. It's the thing that author David Foster Wallace said is the most important feature of good writing, and it's also the thing that's at the core of Paul Millard's philosophy on writing. So what is that thing? Well, here's what I tell my undergrad students. Now, of course, this is for an academic context, but you can apply what follows to any writing context. So I tell them, imagine a room with a table of other researchers in your field. They've been sitting there for a while working on a problem, and it's hard. They can't quite figure it out. So they've been devoting a lot of time and attention to it, and it's forcing them to make certain compromises and to try new approaches. It's a big problem too, so nobody at the table can solve it on their own. This researcher did one part of the problem, this other researcher did an experiment to replicate his results, and another researcher is dismantling an assumption from a previous era, etc. Now, while they're busy working on this problem, you walk into the room, and you want to get a seat at that table. You want them to accept you so that you can start contributing to the problem and be a well-respected member of the field. So, what would be a bad way of getting a seat at that table? Well, if you really wanted to waste their time, then what you could do is just disregard all the work that they've done up until that point. Don't even talk about it. Just present your own ideas independently in a vacuum, in all their glory. Or if you really wanted to piss everyone off, what you could do is just kind of elbow your way into the table, disregard the researchers and all the work that they've done, say they're all wrong without any self-awareness or any qualifying remarks about how they might be right in certain respects or what the limits of your own research are. Now, of course, you wouldn't want to adopt their speech patterns. You can just follow the advice of the writing mavens online who tell you to avoid jargon and totally disregard the insider lingo that these researchers use in their own little social group. That would be a surefire way to get yourself excluded from the group. And at that point, it won't even matter how good your ideas are. Your social behavior in that exchange would all but guarantee that your ideas will be rejected on their face. But what if, to the contrary, you actually wanted these people to like you and accept your ideas? Well, in that case, just do the opposite. Take an interest in the work that has come before you. Show deference to the big kahunas in the field. Reproduce the speech patterns they use to demonstrate to them your in-group status, and be polite in laying out your points of disagreement. Present yourself as a helping hand, not an adversary. All of this is to say that writing is communication. It's a social activity. And although your readers might not be a research community, the social dynamics are exactly the same. As Paul Millerd says, writing is about entering a conversation. We're always using language for some purpose, and the same thing is true about writing. Now, if you're writing valuably, then you are contributing something to an ongoing problem. If you're writing just for yourself, then you're not really writing, you're just journaling. So write in the same way that you would talk, with an interest and concern for your reader. For the 11th writing tool, we're going to tap into a bit of reader psychology. And when you understand how readers process your writing at a cognitive level, then you can shape your writing to create certain effects. Take a look at this line from a Raymond Chandler story. She smells the way the Taj Mahal looks by moonlight. She smells the way the Taj Mahal looks. What is it about the way that this image hits you? And why is it so much more powerful than saying something like, she smelled like patchouli? Or how about that famous scene from Apocalypse Now?
I love the smell of napalm in the morning. Smell! You know that gasoline smell? A whole hill. Smells like victory.
What makes these lines so vivid and so memorable? Well, you know how you might be walking down the street and you catch a whiff of something and it just brings you back to this vivid memory from a long time ago? Smell has such a strong relationship to memory because the part of the brain that processes smells connects directly to our memory and emotion centers. One of language's most powerful tools is the ability to mix up the senses. We can use familiar images to describe an unfamiliar smell, or a familiar smell to describe an abstract idea. We do this all the time. A cold stare, a gravelly voice, the sweet taste of victory. These are all examples of synesthesia, using one sense to describe another, and they let us feel a voice, see a sound, or even smell an emotion. As a matter of fact, at a fundamental level, we don't actually experience anything through a single sense. Perception is the experience of something through all senses. In the really interesting book, The Spell of the Sensuous, which I totally recommend to all writers, the author David Abram writes, "When I perceive the wind surging through the branches of an aspen tree, I'm unable, at first, to distinguish the sight of those trembling leaves from their delicate whispering. My muscles, too, feel the torsion as those branches bend, ever so slightly in the surge, and this imbues the encounter with a certain tactile tension. The encounter is influenced as well by the fresh smell of the autumn wind, and even by the taste of the apple that still lingers on my tongue." So although contemporary neuroscience tells us that synesthesia is a kind of defect, or something you experience as psychedelic effect, what Abrams is saying is that it's actually the fundamental experience. So experiment with synesthesia, start mixing up the senses, because the effect is that it's not exactly magic realism. As we see in the Raymond Chandler passage, there's something very vivid about it. So if you're writing about an idea, try to ground it into something more concrete by blending it with one or more of the senses. Now, do you remember that famous scene from The Wizard of Oz where the Wicked Witch of the West yells, "Fly, my pretties, fly"? Really? That's odd, because she never actually said that.
Take special care of those ruby zippers. I want those most of all. Now fly! Fly!
What is it that makes so many people misremember this iconic line? Well, here's the same writing tool used in another famous scene that you definitely remember.
I admire your luck, Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
These lines are so iconic, all thanks to a writing tool called diacope, a technique where a word or phrase is repeated after a brief interruption. That repetition creates a kind of verbal sandwich that etches the line into your memory, and there are a few variations of it. Now, there's the vocative diacope. Vocative just means you address somebody.
Drill, baby, drill.
Whose motorcycle is this?
It's a chopper, baby.
Whose chopper is this?
Zed's.
Who's Zed?
Zed's dead, baby. Zed's dead.
There's elaboration diacope.
Captain, my captain.
There's extended diacope.
Oh, Romeo, Romeo. Wherefore art thou, Romeo?
Free at last! Free at last!
Diacope, diacope. All the best one-liners use diacope. For lucky number 13, if you've ever read John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, then you definitely remember this unforgettable speech.
I'll be everywhere. Wherever you can look. Wherever there's a fight so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there. I'll be in the way guys yell when they're mad. I'll be in the way kids laugh when they're hungry and they know supper's ready. And when the people are eating the stuff they raise and living in the houses they build, I'll be there too.
See how they keep on returning to the core message after adding long sets of details? That's epistrophe. a technique where you repeat the same word or phrase at the end of successive clauses or sentences. Like the chorus of a song, epistrophe helps your readers stay focused on your core message as you continue to add new details to it. They fuck you up, your mom and your dad. They may not mean to, but they do. That famous line from the poet Philip Larkin uses a little grammar trick that you can use to launch your reader into the rest of your story. It's the same writing tool that we see at the start of Ernest Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea. He was an old man who fished alone in a skiff in the Gulf Stream, and he had gone 84 days without taking a fish. In fact, this writing tool is so powerful that we even find it in the classic opening to all scary stories. It was a dark and stormy night. What these lines have in common is that the first word is an ambiguous pronoun. Now, normally, pronouns link backwards to a noun that has already been mentioned, but in these examples, the pronoun links forwards to a noun that has not yet been introduced. Readers cannot tolerate that ambiguity. It opens up a loop that they want to close. Who fucks us up? Who was the old man? These questions spark curiosity, and they pull the reader into the rest of your story. This clever writing tool is known as prolepsis. By starting with an ambiguous pronoun, you motivate your readers and launch them straight into the heart of your story. When David Foster Wallace writes about his experience aboard a cruise ship, he doesn't just describe it, he drowns you in the details. And that flood of details is exactly why his essay, A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again, became a non-fiction classic. Here are just a few lines from the famous opening of that essay. I have now seen sucrose beaches and a water a very bright blue. I have seen an all-red leisure suit with flared lapels. I have smelled suntan lotion spread over 2,100 pounds of hot flesh. I have been addressed as Bon in 3 different nations. I have seen 500 upscale Americans dance the electric slide. I have seen sunsets that looked computer-enhanced. I have very briefly joined a conga line. I have seen a lot of very big white ships. I have seen schools of little fish with fins that glow. I have seen and smelled all 145 cats inside the Ernest Hemingway residence in Key West, Florida. I now know the difference between straight bingo and prizo. I have seen fluorescent luggage and fluorescent sunglasses and fluorescent pince-nez and over 20 different makes of rubber thong. I have heard steel drums and eaten conch fritters and watched a woman in Silver Lane projectile vomit inside a glass elevator. I have pointed rhythmically at the ceiling to the 2/4 beat of the same disco music I hated pointing at the ceiling to in 1977. This sequence of images is disjointed and sometimes surprising, but they all come together to form a tapestry or a mosaic that establishes a rich context. And that was only the opening paragraph, but after 2 pages of these images, you really get the feeling that you're standing there on the deck with the author. This flood of sensory details is an example of a writing tool called Congeries, a rhetorical strategy that piles up adjectives, nouns, and images to create an immersive, almost overwhelming experience. Now, this next writing tool was passed down to me from my thesis advisor in university. It's something he discovered whenever he was working on his PhD dissertation. His dissertation supervisor was Walter Benn Michaels, an academic literary critic who's very well known for being an outstanding writer and stylist. Now, you don't even have to be interested in American lit to enjoy his writing. It's just so clear, his arguments are rock solid, and he just knows how to make his ideas pop off the page. So you can imagine that if this was your supervisor, you might feel a little timid about the quality of your own writing, especially among academics who basically write arguments for a living. It's really important to not only have important new ideas, but to also be able to write about them in a clear style. And that's when my thesis advisor developed this writing tip: steal style. Stealing style is a way of bringing a writer's voice into your own. To steal style, you find a writer who you admire, analyze their sentences and sections, and try to slot your own ideas into those structures. Now, he told me that when he started doing this, he felt a little bit nervous about bringing one of his chapters to his advisor for feedback. But lo and behold, his advisor was praising him as a good writer. And he said that he sat there kind of thinking to himself like, Oh my God, you don't even realize it. These are your sentences. Now, of course, we're talking about style here, not ideas. Ideas are under copyright, but style is open source. It's yours for the taking. So if you want to steal style, here's a quick exercise. Ask a few of your writer friends which authors they admire and why. Pick a couple of articles or stories from those writers and find a phrase or a passage that stands out to you. Read it 2 or 3 times, and this part's important. Close the book and try to write out that section that you just read. Start with individual sentences, but try to work your way up to paragraphs and maybe even sections. The more you do this, the more their writing style will seep into your own voice. For writing tool number 17, listen to what Kendrik Lamar told Rick Rubin about how he writes.
Do you make notes?
Definitely. All the time. I have to make notes because a lot of my inspiration comes from meeting people or going outside of the country or going around the corner to my old neighborhood talking to a 5-year-old little boy. And I have to remember these things. I have to write them down, and then 5 or 3 months later, I have to find that same emotion that I felt when I was inspired by it. So I had to dig all the way deep and see what were the things that triggered the idea of
Does it always come back?
It comes back.
Okay.
It comes back. It comes because I have key little words that make me realize the exact motion and what drew the inspiration.
And he's not alone. Robert Greene does the same thing, and it's exactly the same technique that he taught his protege, Ryan Holiday. Now, there's nothing systematic about this. These little scraps of paper just pile up. You don't know where it's leading you when you're writing it down, and you might never use it again. Some of these notes just become orphans, but others begin to cluster and aggregate around larger ideas. And as a writer, you'll start to notice the through lines that link them together into these constellations. And that's how these little scraps of paper become ideas of your own. Only it's much easier for us today because we don't have to haul around these shoe boxes full of notes. Personally, I love to use the app Obsidian. It's free, open source, and it doesn't store your files on a server, meaning you never have to worry about data loss or privacy. But more importantly is the architecture of the app. Unlike Notion, which is organized hierarchically with these nesting pages, Obsidian is designed to be horizontal, which means that at any moment, any note can be linked to any other note. So anytime you're creating a new note, you can just chuck it into the vault and forget about it until one day, weeks or even years down the road, when something new occurs to you and you want to pull it up. It's the perfect app for this messy, chaotic note-taking system, and it's what I recommend for you to use for this writing tool, which I call collecting scraps. Now for writing tools 18 and 19, take a look at this passage because it's got a problem in it. One day, as the watching of an informative and entertaining YouTube video was taking place on the part of the clever writer, the creator's subtle request to like, share, and subscribe occurred, causing the clever writer amusement. That passage was hard to read. It's a lot easier to read it if it's written like this. One day, a clever writer was watching a YouTube video that was informative and entertaining when the creator subtly requested her to like, share, and subscribe, which amused her. What makes that one better than the first one? In these passages, there are 2 writing tools at work. First, ask yourself, what's this story about? Obviously, the story has 2 main characters in it. A clever writer, that's you, and the video creator. In the first case, these characters are tucked away into these subordinate positions, but in the second passage, they're placed more prominently in the hierarchy of the sentence. So the first writing tool at work here is to make the main characters of your story the subjects of verbs. Now, second, ask yourself, what's going on here? What's happening in this story? And what you're going to find is that the main actions are watching, requesting, and amusing. So in the first case, these actions are represented in nouns. In the second case, these actions are seated in the verb, which is the heart of the sentence. So the second writing tool is place specific actions in verbs, not nouns. For writing tool number 20, do you remember that great scene in No Country for Old Men when Llewellyn Moss finds the briefcase full of money? Sidebar, you've got to read the book. Now, yeah, everyone says the book is better, but seriously, what's really interesting about the book, No Country for Old Men, is that Cormac McCarthy first wrote it as a screenplay. It was rejected, so he adapted it into a novel, which the Coen brothers then picked up and adapted into a movie. But because the novel was first a screenplay, it's incredibly spare. So reading the novel is like admiring a great engine. It's simple and compact and elegant in its structure and design. So I highly recommend it. And speaking of engines, the reason that scene with the briefcase is so incredible is that it functions as the engine of the story. That single moment when Llewellyn discovers the money is the start of the tragedy, the first domino in the line. It immediately raises a series of questions. Is he going to take the money? Who's the money belong to? Is he going to get away with it? Questions that demand answers and hook you in for the rest of the story. That one moment is the engine of the entire story. It fires up the narrative and keeps you eager to find out how the rest of the story unfolds. So when you're writing your own story, you should hopefully be able to point to that one moment in the opening that serves as the engine of your story, the one that drives forward the rest of your story as it drags your reader behind it. Now for a harsh truth, but one that will hopefully help you write in a way that your readers will find engaging and valuable. And that's the key word here, value. So much writing advice focuses on the formal elements of writing. It says that writing should be clear, organized, and persuasive. But guess what? If your writing is clear and useless, it's useless. If your writing is organized and useless, it's useless. If your writing is persuasive and useless, it's useless. Readers do not care about clarity, organization, or persuasion. Those elements are just the vehicles for delivery, but ultimately, your writing needs to do one thing: deliver value. So what is value? It sounds like an abstract thing, but in fact, it's very clear and precise. Readers perceive writing as valuable when it solves a problem that they care about. Now, I don't mean to sound too utilitarian about that. Of course, we do all kinds of things in our writing. There's self-expression and writing about ideas and opinions. But the fact is that if those things aren't motivated towards solving a problem that readers care about, then nobody's going to read it. So the writing tool here begins with a mistake. Don't write about topics. Nobody cares about topics. If you start off with, in this piece, I will explore the topic of, readers have already left the building. Instead, at the top of your page, you should be able to fill out a problem statement like this. I am writing about topic because I want to find out about question in order to help my reader gain a benefit or avoid a consequence. With these kinds of problem statements, topics are motivated to answering a question, and the answer to that question will either help the reader gain a benefit or avoid a consequence. Now, of course, you don't need to give the reader that problem statement. It doesn't need to be at the top of your published work, but filling out this kind of a problem statement will really help you keep everything on track. That way, you'll be able to delete anything that doesn't directly correspond to that problem statement. Writing Tool 22. Garbage collectors in New York City have a special term for the maggots that they find in the trash: disco rice. And that is about as good a metaphor as you can ever hope to find. But even if you can't write a metaphor this good, do your best to avoid clichés. They drain the life out of your writing. George Orwell warns us that relying on clichés is a shortcut, a substitute for creative thought. In his book Politics and the English Language, Orwell argues that bad writing is the result of bad thinking, and that bad writing has a corrosive effect on civilization. And in that passage, he singles out clichés, which he calls dying metaphors. Dying metaphors have lost all evocative power and are merely used because they save people the trouble of inventing phrases for themselves. Now, if Orwell is right, then writers have a civic duty to keep our language vigorous and alive, actively responding to and reflecting the culture. Using dying metaphors or clichés is just empty talk. It doesn't mean anything. but the role of the writer has always been to detect the signs of cultural change, saying what people think before they even realize it, and offering up these images to the culture. So writing tool 22 is beware the cliché. Speaking of Orwell, he also said that good writing should be like a window pane, so clear that readers can see the world and not the writer. In other words, the best writing doesn't draw attention to itself. It simply lets the story shine through. This idea is especially important when dealing with heavy subjects. Here are two approaches to a heavy subject from the filmmaker Steven Spielberg. First, in the movie Schindler's List, the horrors of the Holocaust aren't exaggerated or sensationalized. Instead, the movie relies on this quiet restraint, which allows the suffering to speak for itself. And the result is haunting. Compare that approach to another movie, Saving Private Ryan, where Spielberg takes the opposite approach. The opening sequence throws you into the chaos of war with brutal detail. Every explosion, every wound, every moment of terror is laid bare. Now, both films are powerful, but for different reasons. And I think that the restrained style of Schindler's List is more engaging for the imagination. It really forces the audience to imagine the worst and fill in the gaps on their own. Similarly, in your writing, you don't need to make everything so explicit. You're not trying to make Saving Private Ryan. When dealing with serious subjects, step back and let the weight of the story do the work. Understate the serious and overstate the light. Let your tone match the weight of your subject, and your writing will carry that much more impact. Number 24 is all about names. Think about all the unforgettable characters from literature. There's Vladimir Nabokov with Humbert Humbert, David Foster Wallace with Rick Vigorous or Hal in Cadenza, but the real king of characters with interesting names is Thomas Pynchon, and here are the top 10 names of Thomas Pynchon characters. Tyrone Slothrop from Gravity's Rainbow, Mike Fallopian from The Crying of Lot 49, Meatball Mulligan from Entropy from a Slow Learner, Reverend Wicks Cherrycoke from Mason Dixon, Pig Bodine from both V and Gravity's Rainbow, Slab from V, Scarsdale Vibe from Against the Day, Benny Profane and McClintock Sphere from V, and coming in at number 1 is Sancho Smilax from Inherent Vice, who was played by Benicio del Toro in the film adaptation. Now, interesting names aren't only for people, they're also places. I grew up not far from a village called St. Louis de Haha, yes, with the exclamation points, and I always thought that that town was a story waiting to be told. And that's writing tool number 24. Collect interesting names and let them invite you to write their story. You don't have to have the character or the place first. You can start with an interesting name, write it down, and then see what that name is inviting you to write about. Writing tool 25 is something I call the Bilbo Moment. Now, think about how The Hobbit begins. Gandalf doesn't just throw Bilbo into this chaotic adventure right away. First, he secures a commitment from Bilbo. He gives him a visit and gives him enough time to feel somewhat comfortable before the real journey begins. Now, as writers, we should be a little bit like Gandalf and do the same thing for our readers. Before you dive into your argument or your big idea, you've got to build trust. That means starting with examples that are clear, simple, and easy to grasp, something that your reader can confidently nod along to. Now, you'll find this technique in most popular nonfiction, but just for an example, I've got a copy of Sam Harris's Waking Up and a more recent title from Nat Eliason, Crypto Confidential. So take a look at how these stories open. Now, with Sam Harris's Waking Up, it's an argument about how we can have spirituality without religion. And it's kind of a complex argument that involves neuroscience, religion, ethics, and at times it can be a little bit demanding. But the book starts off with a vivid story about how Sam Harris went on an overnight camping trip as a teenager, and later taking a trip to Nepal that would completely transform his view about our place in the cosmos. Now, that simple story opens up the conceptual field in which his argument is going to unfold. You also see this at the start of Nat Eliason's book, Crypto Confidential, in which he tells a nerve-wracking story about finding out that he was a few months away from becoming a father. Now, this, of course, has nothing to do with cryptocurrency, but it sets a context, a frame in which the rest of the story and its stakes will be interpreted. And that's what I call the Bilbo Effect. A straightforward, concrete story that lays the foundation for everything that follows. As time goes on, Gandalf brings Bilbo into a world of dwarves, quests, and dragons, and likewise in nonfiction, you can start introducing more abstract ideas like spirituality or cryptocurrency, but only once the reader is on board. Structure your examples from simple to complex, from literal to metaphorical. Lay the groundwork with clear, accessible evidence, and then build on it, stretching your argument with nuance and depth. Be Gandalf. Guide your reader from familiar territory into the more intricate, transformative terrain of your world. Begin with your Bilbo moment. For writing tool number 26, the legendary musician Frank Zappa nailed it when he complained that most guitar solos are played the same way every night.
Do you consider yourself a great guitarist?
Well, I'm specialized. What I do on the guitar has very little to do with what other people do on the guitar. Most of the other guitar solos that you hear performed on stage have been practiced over and over and over again. They go out there and they play the same one every night, and it's really just spotless. My theory is this: I have a basic mechanical knowledge of the operation of the instrument, and I got an imagination. And when the time comes up in the song to play a solo, it's me against the laws of nature. I don't know what I'm going to play, I don't know what I'm going to do. I know roughly how long I have to do it, and it's a game where you have a piece of time and you get to decorate it.
That's the spirit you need when you write. When you sit down to create, don't overthink every word until it's perfectly rehearsed. Instead, set a fixed piece of time, say 20 minutes, take a deep breath, and let it rip. Treat that timed interval like a live solo. Be unpredictable and raw and full of that thrill of improvisation. You have basic knowledge of the instrument, which is grammar and vocabulary. You've got an imagination and you've got taste. So when the time comes to write, rip a solo and leave the results to nature. Now, of course, this is not going to be perfect. If you listen to Frank Zappa's solos, they weren't perfect. But the best stuff never is. For writing tool number 27, think about that classic rule from comedy, the rule of 3, where you set up a pattern with 2 beats and then you hit your punchline with a twist. In nonfiction writing, authors sometimes develop an idea using the wrong strategy. That's the ABA structure. Presenting an example, then a contrast, and then circling back to the original example. But with this structure, the reader never gets a chance to fully grasp the core idea before it's been muddied by the contradiction. So instead, start by presenting 2 similar examples that clearly hammer home your key point. That's AA. And then only after your reader has soaked in that idea do you introduce a contrasting example, which is your B. That contrasting example challenges or deepens the original point laid out in the 2 A's. The steady build of AA creates a solid foundation, which makes that final twist in the B all the more surprising and impactful. For writing tool 28, imagine you were writing about a watch. If you write something like, "This is the minute hand, this is the second hand, this is the clock face," that's called descriptive writing. And it's not really telling the reader anything useful. It's just information. Valuable writing goes further. It doesn't just repeat facts. It finds patterns, unpacks underpinnings, and uses all this information to solve problems that readers actually care about. So with the watch, instead of just naming its parts, you could explain how the gears turn, what mechanisms allow the hands to move in sync, and how does everything align with our experience of time. That's called analytical writing. It shows the bigger picture. It's not information, but analysis that makes your writing not only interesting, but valuable. For writing tool 29, consider this sentence. There was worry that there would be extra homework assigned. Who's doing the worrying? Who's doing the assigning? To whom was the homework assigned? This sentence has been bled dry by zombie nouns. That's when action is represented not as an active verb, but as a lifeless noun. So instead of using zombie nouns, you can punch up your prose by putting real characters in the driver's seats and actions in verbs. The students worried that the teacher would assign them extra homework. When you replace vague, static phrases with active verbs and concrete subjects, it brings your writing to life. Your sentences are more than information. The way you arrange that information in the sentence gives the reader a lot of information about how they should interpret your sentence. So beware zombie nouns, and instead use active verbs that animate the story into something that the reader can picture, because the best writing is visual. It creates a movie in your mind's eye. Writing tool number 30, home stretch. Here are 2 sentences, and just a warning, the first one kind of sucks. Since most startup companies pivot their business models at least once during their early years, first-time entrepreneurs who are not certain about the direction of their venture should not commit all their resources to a single strategy. Did you notice the way that sentence begins? Compare it with this rewrite. First-time entrepreneurs should not commit all their resources to a single strategy if they are not certain about the direction of their venture, because most startup companies pivot their business models at least once during their early years. Long-winded introductory phrases force your reader to hold on to details in their short-term memory while waiting for the main point, which can really bog down their comprehension. So if you find your sentence starting with a long introductory clause, consider moving it to the end or splitting it up into a separate sentence. This way, your reader gets to the heart of your message faster and with less cognitive load. And for writing tool number 31, consider this clunky example. We must cultivate, if we are to inspire future leaders, a deep understanding of community engagement. Readers want to get straight to the action, past the verb and onto its object. But notice how that interrupting clause turns this sentence into a mental obstacle course. As the reader moves through this sentence in time, that interrupting clause makes it hard to see that cultivate is directly tied to a deep understanding of community engagement. So instead, try moving the interrupting element to either the beginning or the end, depending on what comes next. So if the following sentence began with the word communities, then you would want that interrupting element to be at the end of the sentence, such as, if we are to inspire future leaders, we must cultivate a deep understanding of community engagement. These communities may, on the other hand, if the next sentence begins by mentioning leaders, then you could arrange the sentence as follows. We must cultivate a deep understanding of community engagement if we are to inspire future leaders. These leaders may. Readers read most easily when they get through the core of your sentence, so keep the verb closely connected to its objects. By the way, if you got this far, then well done, because I've got to tell you, as I was researching for this video, I was like, man, I want to try like 15 of these writing tools in my next piece. But the problem with that is that it's going to cause overwhelm, confusion, and just more problems, when you should really focus on just one of these. So instead of trying 15 of these in your next piece, watch this video next, because it's going to give you a simple principle that you can follow to make your writing more clear. So be sure to go check it out.